Good morning and welcome. My name is Lise Grande, and I'm the head of the United States Institute of Peace, which was established by the U.S. Congress in 1984 as a national, public, nonpartisan institution dedicated to helping prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict abroad. We're very pleased to welcome everyone to the launch of a new, important USIP report that focuses on strategic stability in space. The report looks at the factors that are contributing to and driving this instability, and it also looks at the efforts of other countries, including our adversaries, to control, perhaps even dominate, the use of space, the types of technologies that can enter space, and the resources that are available in space. We have an exceptional group of panelists with us today, each of whom brings deep technical expertise and knowledge. And we're here to discuss what needs to be done to ensure stability in space in light of the factors that are discussed in the report. It's a privilege to welcome Dr. Scott Pace, the director of George Washington University's Space Policy Institute. To welcome Professor Bruce McDonald from Johns Hopkins, who is one of the authors of the report with Dr. Carla Freeman and Allison McFarland. We're very pleased to welcome Dr. Lal from NASA, to welcome Dr. Nate Daly from the Meter Corporation, and Victoria Sampson, the director of the Washington office of the Secure World Foundation. With his permission, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Scott Pace, who is going to be moderating this morning's conversation.
Thank you. And welcome, everyone. Glad you could be here on this beautiful day. And thank you to the U.S. Institute for Peace for making this great facility available for a discussion of a really, I think, important topic. As was said, I'm the director of the Space Policy Institute over at George Washington University, just a few blocks in that direction. So this is a great location. I was part of the scoping group, but I was, as others will quick to point out, that doesn't mean I'm responsible for everything in the report. But was certainly part of a broad range of people who were talked to, and inputs were taken in thinking about this topic. Our panelists today, again, a great group. Bruce McDonald, the lead author here, teaches at that other school, Johns Hopkins University. And I'm proud to say I actually hired a new assistant professor from Johns Hopkins, so we're all good. He wrote really one of the earliest studies on Chinese space weapons, I think 2008, back in the U.S. Security, on U.S. Security and Council on Foreign Relations. So Bruce has been thinking about this for a long time. He was at U.S. Institute for Peace for several years, and of course now is at Johns Hopkins. And like me, is a fallen engineer, descended from engineering into policy. Dr. Bhavya Lal, Associate Administrator for Technology, Policy, and Strategy at the Office of the Administrator at NASA. Another proud graduate of George Washington University. I'll have to put a plug in for that. But she heads up analytical teams at NASA headquarters, studies and analysis, which in many ways replicates some of the things that I did when I was there, and taking them in new directions. So I consider Bhavya kind of kindred spirit in bringing analysis to bear on space issues. Nat Daly, Principal Architect, System Engineering at the Meter Corporation. I would point out that the system engineering he's dealing with really cuts across all sectors. So NASA, DoD, I think you look at some commercial issues, some things other civil agencies, and maybe a little international from time to time. So in terms of overall, what the overall environment looks like in system engineering, Meter Corporation has, of course, a great amount of technical depth on the subject. My friend Victoria Sampson, the Washington office of Secure World Foundation, a group that NGO that certainly we've partnered with a long time, worked together on the definition of long-term sustainability of space activities and what the guidelines were. So we've crossed paths in the UN structure for many years, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing with the Chinese and other countries, but again, I think a great partnership. And then finally, Carla Freeman, senior expert on China here at the U.S. Institute for Peace, also is one of the co-authors of the report with Bruce and Allison McFarland, also in the China program here at USIP. So her work on China's evolving policy towards space as a strategic frontier is one of the areas of interest in China's global policy. And for me, one of the significances of it, we've noticed and very carefully how China talks about other areas that it considers core interests, and that language is used with respect to things like Taiwan, South China Sea, Tibet, so forth. And I don't know that it's quite been used in space yet, but so certainly China's evolving policies towards space, given precedent with other areas of shared domains, is something of interest. On administrative details, I note the report is now available online, so it's live, and that you can submit in the course of this discussion. You're welcome to submit questions online through the event page, or if in person, there'll be some note cards being collected, and then I'll see them here, and I will try to pick what I hope is the most interesting or provocative ones. And finally, there's coffee and snacks afterwards, so please stick around. With that, we're going to have about 40 minutes of discussions. Each of our panelists have about 5-7 minutes. I've got a series of questions that I'd like to start with, and then we'll take questions from the audience. With that, the lead author, Bruce, invite you to lead off.
Thank you very much, Scott, and welcome everybody here to USIP. This whole effort got started with Patricia Kim and Jennifer Statz here at the Peace Institute about 3 or 4 years ago. And there was growing concerns even then over the trajectory of U.S.-Chinese relations and the lack of mechanisms to resolve issues peacefully. And there were concerns about conflict, especially going into nuclear conflict. And this led to the report Enhancing U.S.-China Strategic Stability in an Era of Competition, Strategic Competition, about 2 years ago. And this led on to a follow-on effort that became more focused on a particular aspect of that growing instability, which was space, which has become a very topical issue, not to mention balloons of recent vintage. But we're facing unprecedented challenges in space and destabilizing challenges as space technology grows by leaps and bounds, just much faster than I think most people are even aware of. Some of the changes are revolutionary, some are almost elementary, and yet have profound impacts, particularly on the business side of space. So this led to discussions among several of us about looking specifically at space and what the challenges to stability are in space. This is just another mix added, another issue added to the overall concerns of instability in U.S.-Chinese relations. We've benefited, fortunately, in the development of this study, benefited from an able panel of experts, 2 of whom are here with us today, and the others who've contributed made great contributions indeed to us. And we are looking at, there are many potential drivers of instability in space, and we polled our experts to find out which of these were the most pressing. You could take your pick from many, and they did, but the three issues emerged as most concerning. One is the issue of what's called entanglement of conventional and nuclear space sensor systems, which poses the threat of the unintended escalation of a purely conventional conflict into the nuclear realm, which nobody wants to see. It wouldn't be in China's interest, it wouldn't be in the United States' interest, but wars have been known in the past to escalate when neither side intended them to escalate, and where nuclear weapons are involved, that could be very scary. So this poses a serious threat, and this was far and away the number one identified issue. The second is the study looked at was looking at the testing and deployment of what are called direct-ascent anti-satellite weapons. These are weapons that would go up and directly collide with a satellite and destroying the satellite, but with the very unfortunate side effect of creating a large debris field which could sabotage other satellites that are in orbit. And if you take, for example, the Chinese test that they conducted in January of 2011, which created several thousand pieces, detectable pieces, trackable pieces of debris, it could lead to collisions with other satellites as well. Now just imagine if there were a conflict and you had several hundred satellites broken up, you would create a huge amount of debris which would run the risk of ultimately leading to making large parts of the orbital area around the Earth unusable. So, and we now have several other countries have tested this technology as well. So there's an issue that needs to be addressed there. And then the third issue was and here it's of a more benign nature, but looking at the growth of satellites, just sheer numbers of satellites. We've all heard about Elon Musk and the number of satellites that he is launching. But to just give you some perspective on this, in the year 2010, there were about 1,000 satellites in orbit. This year, there are over 6,000 satellites in orbit. And get this, the projection by the end of this decade, there will be about 58,000 satellites in orbit. And you don't have to go much further than that, where some of the projections go into hundreds of thousands of satellites in orbit, and yet there's no controlling body to try to regulate this. It's a bit like the Wild West out there. And to give you an idea of the impact this is going to have on business and what the future holds for space, with the advances in technology, that Morgan Stanley predicts that the space industry will grow from $350 billion back in 2016 up to $1.1 trillion. There's a lot of economic activity that's going on there. So we have, there's some immense challenges, and the technology is growing ever faster. That is going to create marvelous opportunities economically. We've all heard about the potential benefits to mankind in space, but unfortunately, there are some potential downsides too. And the hope is that the United States and China, as the two largest space powers, can work together to at least not agree on everything. We're never going to agree on everything, but to identify areas of overlapping interests where we can begin to make progress. And so we have in the report some conclusions and recommendations how to address these issues, most of which revolve around the United States and China to get talking again and to address these issues. So with that, and we've been ably helped by outside people and our panel of experts, and we're proud to have this report released, which we hope will lead to a lot of discussion and questions and interaction and hopefully progress.
Super. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bruce. Lavia?
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, Scott. What Scott didn't say was he was also my dissertation advisor, so it's always interesting to share the stage with your dissertation advisor. So I'm going to hit on Bruce's second and third points about the number of objects and debris in space. And so if you think the sky is falling, hang on, let me, Was I not audible before? Okay, I will look down. So if you think the sky is falling, you aren't entirely wrong. This January, a 2,500 kilograms NASA satellite retired in 2005 re-entered the atmosphere. Just months before, a Chinese rocket had an uncontrolled re-entry. And it isn't just re-entries that are problematic. In recent months, China has complained that a U.S. satellite came too close to comfort to their space station, and there have been a number of close calls to the International Space Station as well. In 2022 alone, we had to conduct three collision avoidance maneuvers. Two of them were fragments from the Russian ASAT test, and the third was a fragment from 2020 explosion of a Russian upper stage tank. So we absolutely have an evolving crisis on our hands. Analysis conducted by NASA's Orbital Debris Program Office shows that the number of objects in space is increasing at an exponential pace. It almost is sort of like a vertical line in the last many years. 2022 alone saw nearly 180 new launches. That's about 4 launches a week, and deploying more than 2,300 spacecraft into Earth orbit. And as of 2023, as I think Bruce mentioned, there's more than 7,000 working satellites in space. And again, the core point is working because there's many, many more defunct non-working satellites. And just the number of satellites, working satellites alone, that's 20 times those as in 1982. Low Earth orbit, the region of space below 2,000 kilometers, has the highest concentration of operational spacecraft as well as debris. But actually something has changed, and I think Bruce kind of hinted to that. So between 2000 and 2010, it was the Chinese ASAT test and the collision between a U.S. satellite and a Russian satellite drove most of the increase. But since 2010, between 2010 to 2023, the proliferation of CubeSats and the deployment of large constellations of spacecraft were primarily responsible for the number of objects in below 700 kilometers. And the other thing that's important to note, because Bruce talked about the role of government, it's a private sector that's leading this transformation. Just 2 companies, SpaceX and OneWeb, have launched nearly 4,400 satellites between just the 2 of them. And these satellites are part of what we call mega constellations, which are basically a group of satellites working together as a team. And there's hundreds or thousands of individual satellites in this. And if you look at ITU filings, and again, Bruce hinted to that, the number of satellites to be launched in the coming years is staggering. Over 430,000 are planned, and obviously, we don't know how many actually end up being in orbit, but we do need to start to think about this. These satellites will need to avoid each other and other spacecraft, and they need to re-enter the atmosphere too, since that's the actual disposal plan for them. And it's hard to believe, but while there are guidelines on how to behave in space, there is no formal governance or what we call authorization or supervision as required by Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty. And again, mega constellations are one part of the debris challenge. There's more than 47,000 objects bigger than 10 centimeters as of this year. And larger objects are just the tip of the iceberg. There's a million objects over, I think, a millimeter, and hundreds of millions ranging from the size of dust particles to flecks of paint that are too small to be tracked. And actually, these are the debris that present the most near-term mission-ending risk to operational spacecraft. And given how heavily our economy and our society started to depend on these spacecraft, it is really important to make sure that they continue to stay operational. 22 was an eventful year, as I said earlier. We detected 4 on-orbit fragmentations, 1 Russian, 2 Japanese, 1 Chinese. Each of them generated hundreds of fragments large enough to be tracked, and of course many more too small to be tracked. And of course this task of tracking is getting harder. And of course one major challenge is, even if we manage our own satellites, our own private companies, and remove our own debris, it's not enough. We own less than half of the total number of objects in space. The rest belong to Russia. I think it's about 30%, China about 20%, and other countries. And by treaty, we cannot touch other countries' objects without their permission. Of course, this is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. Space is a big, diverse, and innovative sector, and together we can come up with approaches that don't just involve technology, but regulatory, policy, and other kind of innovations. The White House and NASA are doing a lot of work in this area, and actually Scott started a lot of that, and we can talk about that later on. But I just want to end by saying that, you know, I spent 25 years in Boston before I came to DC. In Boston, we call the debris problem wicked hard. And to solve problems like this, we really need all hands on deck, and the hands had better also be Chinese. It's not a problem America can solve alone, so let's roll up our sleeves and get to work.
Excellent. Okay, Matt, you're next.
Thank you.
Matt, are up.
Thank you, Scott. I'd also like to point out that on my doctoral committee was Bruce.
Oh, okay, well then.
So I'm also sharing the stage with one of my committee members. And so thank you for the opportunity to contribute to the scoping committee early on in this research, and the opportunity to speak here today. What I'd like to do is take some of the passages that really struck me in this report and highlight these for the audience, and I have a few comments on those. The report quotes, an uncertain era in which domestic and international policymaking is hard-pressed to keep up with technological advances in the field. I would also add technology plus business plus economics and strategy. So strategy, business, and technology, that's the equation for enterprise architecture, and that's kind of my trade as an enterprise architect in the space community. So I'd say it's a little bit more, I'll talk to that a little bit more further on. The report says spacefaring powers and space stakeholders need to, quote, take urgent action to address the implications of this surge in space technology before major problems ensue in the economic and military dimensions of the space domain. Dialogue and cooperation among space powers to address these issues has never been more needed. I believe that the disciplines of research, development, technology, and engineering, systems engineering, and architecture can contribute to that dialogue and cooperation by underscoring its support with direct linkages between space situational awareness to policy and apparent behaviors. The report says, as two of the world's three most formidable space powers, the United States and China both have incentives and opportunities to promote this sort of communication and collaboration. I have a few quotes to highlight that later on, but I would add that well, I'll get to that later on. Furthermore, I like that the report addresses, it would appear worthwhile for U.S. policymakers to review whether U.S. national security concerns about restricting the transfer of space-related technologies to China, and that it might be better served by focusing on restrictions than by broad prohibition on a dialogue with China on important issues. The report goes on to suggest that the United States could work on some aspects of space technology and policy with China where there are opportunities of mutual benefit while consciously avoiding other sensitive areas. So I would point to the successes of the Federal Aviation Administration's SIAS program, the Aviation Safety Information Analysis and Sharing System. I think that's a good example for a systems-oriented solution. It focuses on a minimum viable set of information that's agreed upon that can set and all the participants from the airline industry have agreed to that minimum viable set because it mitigates risk of spilling proprietary information that would give a competitor any advantage. So it's important to kind of focus on a minimum viable information set that might focus on something like a space SIAS or space flight safety. Interactions with China could also provide important insights into directions Chinese space planning is taking. The U.S. Soviet Apollo-Soyuz project that led a joint mission between the U.S. and the Soviets in 1975, the first international crewed space mission, by the way, showed that it is possible to cooperate in space with a sophisticated adversary without losing vital secrets to that rival. So, although China poses a challenge to U.S. and allied interests in space overlapping interests, they still exist. Both sides see great opportunity in space despite differences in perspectives. But space doesn't care. Space debris is indiscriminate about whose satellites it crashes into. The recent 4 January low-intensity explosion breakup of Cosmos 2499 and the associated 85 pieces at 1169 kilometers altitude exemplify that. So both sides have an interest in more efficient space traffic management than ever in this congested environment, and both sides share these interests with other space actors as well. The report also goes on to address unilateral, bilateral, and multilateral action to tackle these three drivers that Bruce enumerated of instability that take various forms and encompass not only a dialogue, but also concrete steps that build on unilateral measures and one another. I'd add that another information sharing design, polycentricism, is a potential candidate for future U.S. China space relations, as I alluded to with the Space SIS system. In fact, in 2022, Dr. Mariba Jha testified before Congress regarding manufacturing in space. He said, in order to meet the needs of this community, there must be an unambiguated, distributed, immutable ledger of who did what to whom, when, and where. As of this very testimony, I would challenge any government to demonstrate that it is currently capable of delivering such a capability. More complaints of harmful interference, damage, and threats will be raised whilst we are left ill-prepared to assemble the evidence required to assess and quantify space events and activities. So let me give you another example from some of my original research in the field from 2019. And this is from China's Deputy Director of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the World Space Forum. He said, reshaping and adaptation of space traffic management initiatives involves complex questions. Who will be the manager? Who will manage STM? How will and how can we combine all stakeholder aspects of space technology and policy with China, where there are opportunities and mutual benefits while consciously avoiding sensitive areas, unquote. So again, I'd point to the successes of that SIS program because it sets a good example of a systems-oriented solution. It focuses on that minimum viable information set that I had mentioned. All right, so I'd argue that both sides recognize the value of purposely engineered systems for coupling information shared systems that promote international transparency and confidence building measures. Architecture and system engineering, they can be utilized to galvanize strategic and constructive engagement plans to achieve conditions of stability in space and subsequently a viable global space economy. Social sciences and constructive engagement methods can be coupled with systems engineering and architectures in impactful ways. The space peace conflict spectrum requires mindful and purposeful integration. Without shaping its progress, we're left watching it to play out as Russia conducts ASAT testing uncannily close to the invasion of the Ukraine, or threats to Starlink and Viasat continued. So indeed, as we've seen last year, the consequences of doing nothing are not nothing. With respect to polycentricism, I'll wrap up with this. Victor and Eleanor Ostrom first theorized that political units could operate in a coherent manner with predictable patterns, that is a system, to the extent that they take each other into account in competitive relationships, enter into various contractual and cooperative undertakings, and have recourse to central mechanisms to resolve conflicts. So in this way, we can weave a fabric of information flows that intentionally strengthens efforts of constructive engagements toward the goal of realizing conditions of stability that are better for business, create economic conditions for all to flourish. So these polycentric kinds of designs for information flows and governments could result in the creation of stronger and more hubs and flows which can catalyze norms cascades as well. And so I'll conclude with that for now.
Okay, so lots to think about. And Victoria.
Thanks, Scott. This is exciting for me because there are not one, not two, but three SIS people on the panel. No one ever is from SIS in space. This is just like a big day for me. Anyways, thank you to USIP for inviting me to participate and to speak at this panel. I'll be talking about two things essentially during the few minutes I have. First of all, talking about counterspace capabilities, and then a little bit about the UN discussions on space security. My counterspace discussions come from my organization, the Secure World Foundation. We're a nonprofit that focuses on the long-term sustainable use of outer space. I'm the co-editor of our global counterspace threat assessment. which we put out every year. It's an unclassified source of looking at counter space capabilities that we see around the world. We look at 5 different categories. One of them is direct-ascent ASAT, has been discussed here. Another one is co-orbital, where the interceptor gets up into orbit and either does a close approach to interfere or some way in which take out the target. Another one is directed energy, looking at lasers essentially, mostly to affect imagery. The fourth is radio frequency interference, jamming, and then the 5th is cyber. I will not go into exhaustive detail on all those, but I will point out that when we first started working on this document in 2018, we had 6 countries we were covering. The most recent version from last year, we're in the process of updating it now, but the 2022 version has 11 countries. So you can see that this topic is growing and counter space capabilities are proliferating. Relevant to this discussion, I'll focus mostly on direct-ascent ASAT. So there's strong evidence that China has been doing a sustained amount of research and development on a broad range of counter space capabilities. And they've got 1, possibly 3 programs to develop a direct-ascent anti-satellite capability. But I'd like to divide that into 2 different options. One, looking at what kind of targets it can hit. Specifically, how high up can they go? So low Earth orbit is about 0 to 2,000 kilometers, and it has a mature capability to be able to target those satellites that are there. But higher up, medium Earth orbit, which is about 20,000 kilometers. I'm talking to U.S. audience, 12,000 miles. And then again, geostationary orbit, which 36,000 kilometers, 24,000 miles, does not have that capability. And I think it's important to make that distinction because oftentimes, here in the media, we say, okay, China can hit U.S. satellites, and you assume that every satellite everywhere is a threat. Not exactly. I don't want to downplay the threat, but I think you cannot make good policy decisions if you don't have a good sense of what the threat actually is. And then just to kind of contextualize it, the United States has no official direct-ascent anti-satellite weapons program, but it has demonstrated a direct-ascent anti-satellite capability with its missile defense interceptors in 2008 when it shot down a deorbiting U.S. satellite. And so that is operational, it's there. And the U.S. has developed direct-ascent anti-satellite capabilities in the past, both kinetic and nuclear, and probably could develop them pretty quickly if it decided to do so in the near future. And so I'm happy to talk more about counter space stuff in the, if there's more Q&A, but just talking specifically about how do we handle this sort of thing. The United Nations has been focusing on various aspects of space, both civil space and security space. The civil space side of the house, which Scott Pace has been very involved in, I think has done a lot of work in terms of establishing guidelines for long-term sustainable use of space. The security side of the house of the UN has been stopped, and this is not just a space thing. It's been a non-proliferation thing, where they haven't been able to agree on the agenda to discuss, much less move ahead in discussions. And having followed these discussions for over a decade plus, the part of the problem is that there's a disconnect in terms of how the major players identify what the threat is for space. The U.S. and its allies looks at it more of a congestion test, an almost environmental issue, where behavioral aspects are concerned, bad behavior on orbit. Whereas Russia and China and their allies tend to focus more on, they're worried about a specifically designed weapon being placed into space and targeting from space to ground, essentially space-based missile defense interceptors. And then, so that's one disconnect. And the other disconnect is, how do you handle this? Do you do a treaty? Which frankly, there has not been a real treaty on space in 4+ decades, so probably not, at least not right now. Or do you do a non-binding norms approach? And that's kind of where the UN has gone to at this point. They're entering year 2 of a 2-year program called an open-ended working group, which is a very UN designation, but basically it's the idea that it's open to any UN member that wants to participate in discussion on space threats. And it's meant to be inclusive, so civil society is allowed to participate in terms of being there to watch. So I was actually just, they had the 3rd meeting out of 4 last week in Geneva. I was there, just kind of civil society observational category. And so it's been interesting because they're trying to define what the major threats are to space security and stability, and how do you identify responsible behavior in space. And so, obviously there's not 100% agreement, and we can go into where probably some of the problems are later. But I will point out, one of the things that's coming up is a lot of countries are identifying things like deliberately creating debris on orbit as something that's irresponsible. That is to say, through deliberately having destructive direct-ascent anti-satellite missile tests. And this builds on to a unilateral commitment the United States made. Actually, we're coming up on a year anniversary. It was April of 2022, where the U.S. made the commitment not to conduct destructive anti-satellite missile tests. It has since been joined into that commitment by 9 countries. So there's 10 countries total, and I think there's going to be a few more coming on soon. But also there's a UN General Assembly resolution in December where 155 countries voted in support of this type of commitment. And so you can see, okay, we're seeing this sort of norm evolving, or this idea of responsible behavior evolving. And there are some people who would look at this issue and say, well, if it's really that important and scary, why don't we have a treaty? Well, treaties don't just jump out whole cloth. You have to have discussions, and then you look at the Outer Space Treaty. There are discussions, and the UN General Assembly resolutions, and then eventually an Outer Space Treaty. So I think just because it doesn't solve every problem doesn't mean it can't be helpful in solving this problem. The problem is, of course, as Bhavya brought out, the idea of debris. I mean, the debris that's created from these anti-satellite tests, it's agnostic. It does not care if you are an ally of the person who created it. If you are in its way, you'll be affected by it. And as of right now, we don't have any way in which to take out debris that's created. There are a lot of companies working on that, and I hope that'll happen soon. But for right now, what's up there, we're stuck with. And so the idea is you don't want to deliberate more. So hopefully this direct-ascent anti-satellite test moratorium will continue and be expanded upon. I look forward to discussing more during the panel. Thank you.
An analogy somebody once gave me was that, being in a pool, if somebody pees in the pool, you can't really be safe.
That is very accurate, yes.
Carla?
Well, I guess it's good afternoon now, and thanks so much as the USIP China team representative on the panel and a co-author on the report. It's really my honor to join such an esteemed group of experts today, and all of you in the audience. I also want to mention that if we had been able to squeeze another chair on this podium, on this stage, the third author on the report, Allie McFarland, would be joining me here and making remarks. And I see our publications team way up there, and I want to thank them for their hard work on this report, which is now live on the website and will be in hard copy, I think, quite soon. So look, as we look for pathways to stability in space, we understand China as a highly competitive actor in space with ambitions to lead space-related innovation, exploration, commercial activities, military capabilities. China understands space as the commanding heights in future economic development and warfare, and it appears to be pursuing a goal of leading or even dominating the use of space between the Earth and the Moon. It's been ratcheting up milestone after milestone in space, suggesting that that goal may be achievable. At least it looks that way. It's not just headlines like the completion of the Beidou satellite network or the landing of the placement of the U2 Jade Rabbit rover on the far side of the Moon, or its Tiangong space station, or plans for these Guowang mega constellations, but also its expansion of a range of national security and counterspace programs that some fellow panelists study closely. Let me just add a couple of points to the discussion already laid out by these experts here. With the space environment a global commons beyond the sovereign control of any state and accessible to all, the growing congestion in space as more and more players enter space, as has been described, along with intensifying great power competition and particularly U.S. China strategic rivalry, and then all of China's ambitions, its civilian, its military capabilities, and all of these activities in space, all of these elevate the risk of a tragedy of the commons situation. So in our report, we approach the challenge of China and instability in space from the point of view that sustaining the stability, that the usability of space is a global issue on which the United States can lead and which all countries, including China, are stakeholders in. The fact is that space debris, as Nate said, is indiscriminate in what it strikes. It doesn't know what country's assets it's hitting. And coordinating satellite orbits for mega constellations have broad international benefits, both technical and actually that go to our very human identity, in that unregulated growth could be disruptive to science, but also could literally brighten the night sky. And then lowering the risk of entanglement, of course, is key to reducing the risk of an existential issue of nuclear warfare. So I thought I would contribute to the discussion today just by laying out briefly what China's positions on all of the three issues that we highlight in the report are. First, on nuclear entanglement, as we point out in the report, China has indicated that a U.S. use of strategic nuclear satellite assets in a purely non-nuclear role would make them legitimate targets of Chinese and Chinese anti-satellite actions. And so that suggests that in the event of a conventional conflict between the two nations, the U.S. has to be prepared for potential Chinese attacks on an essential part of our nuclear infrastructure. So we have, of course, proposed that the U.S. take steps unilaterally to disentangle its nuclear and conventional mission architectures and encourage as well a U.S.-China strategic stability dialogue. And the two sides appeared to agree, at least at the Biden-Xi meeting in November 2021, that that was a good idea. But that dialogue hasn't taken place, even as Beijing continues to expand its nuclear arsenal and the U.S. is modernizing its own. And Bruce mentioned the 2021 USIP report, and I think that presciently reflected, given that the two countries have never launched any regular official dialogue on strategic stability, that there's a significant perception gap over the potential impact of U.S. missile defense on China's second strike capability. And the idea is if that failure to bridge the gap persists, Beijing's just going to continue to build up its nuclear forces, and that will inspire a security dilemma. In Washington, that Beijing is intent on it transitioning to a far more aggressive, dangerous nuclear posture. On debris, to date, China's taken a pretty defensive position with respect to its ASAT test and to ASAT testing and space debris generally. Some Chinese experts have sought to or have articulated a justification for the 2007 ASAT test that generated such a massive debris cloud on the grounds that the current space regime lacks clear regulations on space debris and what constitutes quote-unquote harmful contamination. And in the aftermath of the launch, a number of Chinese analysts contended that a key motive for the test was peaceful, actually aimed at encouraging the United States to undertake space arms control. As I've written elsewhere, Chinese scholars, so these are unofficial views, they've also criticized the current space regime with respect to regulations on space debris, notably been on the defensive about their own debris cloud, including invoking lex ferenda on the idea that states may establish new rules by their legal acts, a concept also used by some Chinese legal scholars with respect to maritime rights. And Chinese experts have also invoked the right under the OST to dispose of their satellites as Chinese national property. In addition, in defending the test, they've explicitly pointed to the principle of free access, which is interesting, adding that space is not the privilege of any single country, but for all countries to enjoy the province of mankind. This past December, as Victoria mentioned, China voted against the UN General Assembly resolution for countries not to conduct direct-ascent anti-satellite tests that create space debris. Just to wrap up, at the same time all of this is happening, China has also called for improvements to space governance, particularly with respect to the protection of space assets, also talking informally about establishing technical and technological approaches to mitigating debris. So I guess just saying, given the high stakes of inaction, we propose some fairly modest ways, step forward, have been described that reflect the fact that these are areas where our two countries and the international community have profound and even, I would say, existential stakes. Stop there.
Awesome. Super. I noticed on the agenda I was given a little time to sort of reply and rebut, but really this is about the panelists, but if I might take moderator privilege to just to have a few comments. So one of the things that maybe not a statement, really a question is, sort of what do we mean by instability? because of course there's all kinds of instability, nuclear escalation stability, sort of crisis stability, first mover advantage, some things done by Rand, I think, on what my first mover advantage might be. You know, does it mean that we're concerned about a lack of resilience, that we don't have enough stability, and therefore somebody might get a benefit from an attack? So a linkage between conventional and nuclear escalation. And if that latter is the case, there could be an argument for active defenses in space in order to defend against attacks, to create greater resilience and therefore greater crisis stability. But that, of course, produces linkages between space-based defenses, ballistic missile defenses, ground-based ASATs. So previous things which are kind of in separate compartments start becoming very, very linked. And it's really hard to figure out how the other side is going to perceive all that, you know, without having some more of these dialogues. Unfortunately, it's a dialogue that really hasn't happened. We've tried to have the Chinese dialogues and three-party talks, of course, on nuclear. We've tried to have a number of security discussions, and of course, those haven't really happened. And on one hand, the voice of optimism says that we're not that far apart from China on many space things. We've had positive discussions, for example, on space resources. We've had some space science activities, although we wish they were more open about some of their data. We have areas where I think we are in agreement about some things that have a common threat, like space debris. On the other hand, we've seen China's behavior in other shared domains that don't follow really rules of international law, whether it's Antarctica, whether it's the South China Sea, whether it's Uyghurs, Tibet, Taiwan, I mean, the list goes on. So space isn't yet in one of those, I think, crisis categories where it's a zero-sum game discussion. So there's hope, but on the other hand, behavior in other domains, of course, has been problematic. I think one of the other things we should sort of think about is where could we have some starts at discussion. You know, to some extent, it's important to realize that space cooperation follows political events. It doesn't precede them. Mm-hmm. So as I mentioned, Apollo-Soyuz test project was done out of a detente decision between the Soviet Union and the United States coming out of a summit meeting with Nixon and Brezhnev. And it followed after that. We didn't have space cooperation first, and then we decided we're going to have detente. So the political conditions, I think, have to be there. So we can't have space cooperation get too far out ahead of where the political realities are. Nonetheless, I think there are things that we could do. Open exchange of scientific data, exchange of biomedical data, for example, lunar sample exchanges. You can imagine a number of things that could be done that the political freight could bear. But it's important not to overreach and do things that I think that it can't. One suggestion that I've heard for finding a channel, given how fraught bilateral U.S. China discussions might be, is to take a model from what the UN has done on GPS and GNSS and BeiDou and so forth. There is a international consultative group associated with the UN Outer Space Committee, Outer Space Office, that's merely an information sharing entity. And you could imagine, and so the ICG for GNSS has met for years and years and has been a source of increasing transparency among operators of satellite navigation systems. One could imagine a similar sort of structure, information only sharing, no authority, but where states at the state party level would come to discuss information about, say, lunar operations. Be very careful not to cross streams with Geneva and open-ended working group and conference on disarmament. But there's a number of fairly imminent decisions that we need to make. If we're going to be on the South Pole of the Moon, Chinese are going to be on the South Pole of the Moon, how big is your landing zone? What's guard frequency? We have positive commitments for the rescue and return of astronauts. How do we carry out our space safety sort of obligations? So there are plenty of things I think to discuss in a purely civil, international, even commercial kind of activity that we could do in a multilateral forum that would not necessarily have to implicate, you know, a U.S. China security dialogue. Worthwhile as that is, I don't think we can wait for it because there's other operations that are going to be going on fairly soon. Now, at the final two comments, a lot of discussion about norms of behavior sometimes give the idea that norms are a thing, that they're a rule that others are then obligated to follow. It's like saying, well, because I have a stop sign, there won't be somebody running through the stop sign. Having a stop sign is really important, not because it stops the speeder, but because it's a signal to the community that established the stop sign as to what they value. So I would argue that norms are more for our friends than they are for our adversaries. They're more for, here's what responsible behavior looks like, and here's people who share that. And we want that to be as broad as possible and as many people as possible to share in that. But the idea is when bad things happen, we want to be able to turn to our friends and allies and go, we all agree that was bad, right? And now how do we respond to that? So it's a different way of looking at norms. And then finally, maybe perhaps on a pessimistic note, and maybe Carla can push back on me on this one, it really doesn't have to be this way with China. You know, it's certainly been a history that Asia has done better as China has grown and become wealthy and positive. One can certainly look at where Taiwan is today. You can look at what Hong Kong used to be. And say that, you know, that Chinese culture, Chinese people, the Chinese economies and history all have very, very positive contributions to make to the world. The problem is the Chinese Communist Party. And we've seen many of my China scholar friends, you know, are kind of depressed because they had seen what they thought was a progression since Mao with Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and now we come to Xi Jinping, who has taken the party in a very, very different direction. And to some extent be internally criticized for maybe making too many enemies on too many fronts at once. But his behavior is one that looks pretty much like a very committed Marxist-Leninist, a Leninist party, which suborns other things in society to that. Again, doesn't mean we can't deal with it and find ways to peacefully coexist, as the old phrase goes. But China has made a choice politically. And it didn't need to be that way, but it is what it is. And so at the end of the day, when we think about our common interests in space, it's not going to be enough to get agreement with fellow space people that we all kind of know and like and appreciate. Fundamentally, there's going to be a political decisions in how China relates to the rest of the world, of which space is sort of just going to be a symptom. I'll stop there. Let me turn and go to sort of the moderated kind of questions, and I kind of threw this out to begin with, is what does crisis stability in space mean in context, in terms of the report, in terms of what you think we ought to be focused on, and how does that differ between the US view and, say, a China view in talking about crisis stability? Over to anyone.
I can comment on that a little bit, and this ties back to what you mentioned about norms. Most people are familiar with Finnemore and Seekirk's seminal work on international norms and the norms cascade and the tipping point and reaching critical mass. But also in that same report, Finnemore and Seekirk talk about what they refer to as how interdiscursivity leads to intersubjectivity. In other words, the more you talk, the more you understand each other. And the inter being the point. You can have different conversations about the same thing because they're in different contexts. But the inter implies that there is some kind of connection across those two contexts that bridge them. And I think that helps to understand that sometimes, let's see, the subtitle says Pathways to Peace in an Era of U.S. and China Strategic Competition. Sometimes it's more about the pathway than it is about peace. And I think in that context, through constructive engagement, which Finnemore is a constructivist, I think that's a clue that points to that pathway. Simply having those conversations, I think, is an important thing to help ameliorate those differences of mindset.
A friend of mine, all of you probably know Rose Gottemuller, who is the negotiator, you know, in sort of New Start. She wrote a wonderful book about her experience, you know, doing sort of negotiation. One of her, you know, end points was her stress of the importance of maintaining and continuing strategic dialogue, not because you think you're going to get a product next week, but to make sure that you had at least an understanding of, you know, sort of the worldviews, so that if you do have an opportunity to do something, you're not starting from scratch. And so I think she was successful in part because she was well known. They knew her, Russians knew her, she knew them. There was no fooling around. And getting to know you. And so you're preparing maybe for a future opportunity, if not one today. But Bruce, instability?
Yeah, I think of instability in a classic, almost physics sort of way, and I don't, for those who are not physicists in the audience, I don't want you to be turned off by that. The idea of stability is that if you have a system and you perturb it a little bit, that it is in the natural inclination of that system to want to return to a stable point again. A little bit like if you had a pendulum, you divert it a little bit and it goes back and forth and it stabilizes. And unstable or instability is where you have a perturbation and it just gets worse and worse and worse. You have, in the nuclear realm, escalation. And so when I think about stability in space, which, oh my God, gives me a chance to plug a recent publication that I had on crisis stability in space. But I think of it in terms of that you have a system that is set up so that you are as impervious as you can be to destabilizing actions, which I think of it also in the way that was described by General Hyten as your adversary wakes up and says, nah, not today. It isn't going to work out well for me if I do this. That's why, although I voiced concern about these mega constellations, that the one thing that's very appealing about them is that they make it almost impossible to negate your adversary's system. And you can't negate his, and he can't negate yours, so that you have no incentive to want to attack. Whereas in the way we used to monitor, or we're in the process of transitioning away from, we used to have just a few detection satellites for ICBM launches, and so that there aren't many targets to take out. And if you can successfully attack just a few, you can deal a really harsh blow to your adversary, and that's a very destabilizing situation where there are advantages to going first. Whereas when you have a whole big constellation of satellites, which it's hard to negate the impact of the entire system. And so that's a more stabilizing situation. The problem comes by having unregulated growth or uncontrolled growth in that. So to me, there are various techniques you want to develop which could build stability into the system by the way that your system is set up.
Mm-hmm. Carla, for crisis stability from a Chinese viewpoint, maybe space or generally?
I'm not sure I can answer that question clearly. I mean, China is both strategic and has an approach where it is very iterative and moves forward with policy by testing and then reassessing and then moving forward again. So I think China is right now viewing space as I suggested, a strategic new frontier, which is language that's used in some draft legal language that is in a new national security law. And China is looking at every possible opportunity in space. What I think China would like to see is more governance of the kind of UN-centered governance that reflects China's preferences in all facets of on all domains in space, all uses, whether commercial or military. And it's not getting much traction in its initiatives, and so is very frustrated by that. So I think has sort of taken itself out of the game, except to continuously propose with Russia the same treaty legislation, treaty language, and that sort of thing. But I think China sees a UN or centrally governed space regime that protects its interests, its commercial interests, its sovereign interests in space as the key to crisis stability in space.
It's interesting because in other sort of like domains beyond Earth, including the oceans, but also thinking about cyberspace and thinking about space, the tendency internationally seems to be more toward multi-stakeholder kind of analysis. And the Russian and Chinese tendency to say that only state parties are really legitimate actors and everybody else is there by sufferance, is really not the way that certainly the internet develops, certainly not the way space is developing in many other areas. So I hear that Chinese position, just as I hear the Russian position that only state actors were legitimate actors, which is why we got Article 6 at the end of the day, and how they're going to adapt to that, reality when there is more than that. But to the point of adapting, we go, it's maybe one of the larger objects in the room is the idea of a space race. So we spend lots of lectures talking about the old Soviet U.S. space race. There's a lot of talk today about a space race. My former boss talked about a space race, sort of with China. How is, leaving aside the question, should we characterize it as a race, or how should we say, how is the race or competition today different than what it was in the past? And I want to put Bobby on the hot seat because her boss also uses the phrase. So what can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. So when Administrator Nelson talks about the space race, he isn't talking about Apollo times. He isn't talking about a one-time landing on the moon. We won that race more than 50 years ago, right? The space race the administrator is talking about is a strategic competition with multifaceted outcomes, including sustained presence on the moon, Mars, and beyond, for national economic advantage, for supporting our industry, but just as importantly, it's as a net benefit to humanity, such as things like increased knowledge. So that's not how we spoke about space race in earlier days. And again, I just want to remind folks that this strategic competition isn't just about space. It's President Biden has called China America's most consequential geopolitical challenge. So there is this whole of government strategic competition with China, and space is an element of that. And the race is the investment in R&D, in technology, and the next generation of workers. But last point, so the space race the administrator talks about is about supporting U.S. values such as broad international participation, scientific data sharing, openness and transparency of motivations, and a focus on a civilian-led space exploration program as opposed to a military-led one. So that's a space race. That's how we think about the space race at NASA, and that's the one we intend to win.
Scott, can I jump in here?
Please.
So I often get asked, is the U.S. in a space race with China? And I don't think that's helpful because, as Bobby said, that's not the case. But I think that kind of phrasing does put it in an adversarial sort of way, which, again, the U.S. doesn't know what to do about China. I think we have a difficult relationship with them in many different circumstances, not just space. But I think it's not helpful because it automatically basically rules out any option for any kind of engagement. And whether or not we like it, China is there in space, and they are a major actor. They've got humans up in orbit. Frankly, their space station is going to outlast the ISS. The International Space Station is going to be, at some point, it's going to be done, whether it's next year or 2030. Whereas the Chinese Tiangong just became operational last year. And then looking at the moon, I think it's where again, you do not want to automatically replicate the power, scares in orbit on the moon. I think, yes, definitely there's competition, and I think that that's where you even need more engagement because, as was mentioned earlier, if you have a common moon landing spots, you want to be able to discuss things. You want to make sure you're not accidentally kicking dust up over each other. You're not going to be going into each other's zones. And so you need to be able to speak to each other and have these conversations. Again, whether or not you're partners, whether or not you're working with each other, you're still actors and you're still in an extremely hostile environment. There's no need to make it more hostile by having these inadvertent, vocabulary choices that lead you to have an automatic adversarial role.
That's right.
So I'd like to also add Dr. Namrata Goswami and Pete Garrison's book, Scramble for the Skies. They look at it rather than a race, more like a scramble, like the scramble for Africa, like the gold rush era, with the potential global economic opportunities with these untapped resources. as a scramble, it becomes more of a business case. No one nation's tax revenue base can financially support the infrastructure that's going to be required to continue a viable space exploration and lunar resource mining, celestial mining, Mars. Business is going to have to get involved. And in order for business to get involved, it's going to come down to revenue. Right? So there has to be a viable business case. In order to do that, you're going to have infrastructure, and we're going to have to have sustainability assurances to support that infrastructure so that that stability is created for that business globally, really.
Well, let me reminded to audience to hand in note cards. I'll have us come down and collect those, and also for people who've made comments online, I can be sort of looking at them here and pull that up. One of the questions already here is that it appears a single bad actor can make LEO and maybe MEO unusable with relatively lower technology capabilities, and that they're unstoppable. Is a solution partial mandatory sanctions for developing such capability? I feel like I'm hearing a non-proliferation argument. How far do we go?
I can take first crack at that. I mean, the Outer Space Treaty allows for countries to have access to space for peaceful use. And that's the issue, is that you cannot say, most technology, you cannot say definitively, this is meant for peace, this is meant for war when it comes to space. A lot of it's just dual purpose. It depends on what you do with it, it's your intention. And so that's the problem we run into when the international community talks about like non-proliferation issues. For space is that you can't you do in other things. For example, if you don't want countries to have nuclear weapons, what do? You prevent them from having fissile material. But you can't do that with space because so much of the technology just depends on what you want to do with it. It depends on your intentions. And so that is not a helpful way of looking at it. What is helpful is having the idea of establishing, okay, what is considered responsible behavior? What is considered a norm? So you can call out bad actors, so you can point fingers and say, okay, you actually did a bad thing, as opposed to just saying, well, you don't like my country, so you're going to criticize anything I do. And it's not going to solve every issue, but I think it's going to help really establish the practices that make space more stable and predictable over the long term, which is really important.
I think that's right. I would say that keying off the question about a race, one of the other reasons why today is not a race in the same way that it might have been in the past, not only is there not a fixed end line and so forth, and it's just two parties, but the competition in the 60s was about, look how cool I am, I can do something nobody else can, don't you want to hang out with me? And so it was in the context of decolonialization, new independent states that were coming into the UN, bidding for hearts and minds and all that. So today, with space much more accessible to people, both commercially and many more countries participating in it, leadership is very different. It's not, look how cool I am, it's like, look at all the people who want to work with me. And so it has much more, I think, of an inherently cooperative end to it. And I would submit that Russian and Chinese behavior so far has actually been counterproductive to their own interests, because people are more reluctant to work with them. Yes, they're important, yes, and we should be thinking about how to engage or deal with. But I think for a lot of developing countries, they're looking at where are our opportunities and who's going to protect our interests with infrastructure. We're against conflict in space, not just because we don't like conflict, but because we don't want to risk the infrastructure that we're all dependent on. So I think in this competition, there's a lot more areas of common interest that we have for.
And a really good example of that, Scott, is the number of countries that have signed on to Artemis Accords and the number that we think are going to be signing in the near future.
And the Chinese are welcome to sign at any time.
Absolutely.
And China
not a joke, not a joke.
And China has not won over as many hearts and minds as we have. If there is a race for hearts and minds, the United States is doing, as you're pointing out, Scott, a whole lot better than Russia and China are. And it's one thing, mentioning the vote in the United Nations about the direct-ascent ASAT testing ban. If it were a close vote, that might say something. But the vote was 155 to 9. It sounds like a cricket score or something. I mean, you don't very often see votes that are that lopsided. And if I were China, it would be making me say, maybe I need to take a second look at my approach, because you're not doing very well. And the hearts and minds issue in space, the United States appears to have a big lead.
Yeah, and I would say it's not as if this has to be a zero-sum game. If the International Lunar Facility that the Chinese and Russians, want to do comes together, I think it's reasonable to ask, well, by what principles do you govern? Are you committed to international law? Are you committed to safe and sustainable operations and so forth? And if they did something even semi-reasonable, I think you could argue for cross-recognition. You guys recognize what we're doing with Artemis. We'll recognize what you're doing there. We'll have some multilateral channels to discuss operational issues for safe and responsible operations. Mm-hmm. And I think the area to be hopeful, and again, it could always go bad, but in comparison to, say, the South China Sea. So I've had friends who, in dialogue with the PLA Navy, talking about safe and responsible operations, and frankly, they were told, you, American, want this because you want to feel safe out here. You don't belong here, you should go home. Mm-hmm. Pretty much cuts the conversation off. That's not the case in space. That's not the case in operations, on the moon. So we don't necessarily, we're not doomed to take what happens on Earth in space, but we should be paying attention to the political leadership, their behavior in other areas. All of that is relevant, but it's not fate that it has to be like that. Sorry, editorial, but.
Scott, if I could just, one point I'd like to make for the Artemis Accords, there's actually one country that has signed the Artemis Accords and also signed in to participate in the Russia-China International Lunar Research Station, that's the United Arab Emirates. So I think it's really interesting to see, those are not necessarily competitive. Maybe they're complementary, who knows? The International Lunar Research Station is a MOU that Russia and China signed a couple years ago prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and since then China has kind of quietly stepped back on it, so it's hard to say. But it's possible that they could work together. And the other point I'd like to make as well is I think oftentimes in the United States we tend to say that Russia and China, boom, same team, same thoughts, they're not. They have different interests, they have different investments. Frankly, Russia has proven definitely they're willing to be a pariah state internationally. They have no commercial space system. Their civil space program is in tatters. They do not have a way in which to build their own space station as much as they say they're going to do one to replace National Space Station. And no countries really want to work with them. You see how many countries pulled out over the past year in terms of working with ESA on Mars program and things like that. Whereas China has been able to effectively use their space program as a soft power outreach in terms of launching other countries' satellites and getting more countries on board for their cooperation. So I think it's important to make the distinction that one does not necessarily have the same ends and goals as the other, because again, China has a commercial space program sector that's really burgeoning. It's surprising, it really is. So I think it's important to really look at them separately to figure out what their interests are and what their goals are, because that's the only way you can make good policy, is having a clear-eyed look at the situation as it exists, not as would help from a political circumstance.
We have a question here, interesting. It says the Biden administration talks about the importance of allies in U.S. China competition. So what role can allies play in space, and who are the key allies, given their space capabilities? This is not just about the U.S. and China, it's really the rest of the world, as we've been sort of talking to, but can we drill that down a little deeper? Who's the most important ally, if you want to make somebody unhappy? What should be priorities for allies? And
I would argue that, if I may, that I think our most important ally is the European Union. It is so that as a grouping, there is so much expertise there. The small satellite revolution got started by was it Surrey in England. Now they can't say given Brexit what we could say there, but anyway, the nice thing is you don't have to pick among your friends. We're all working together, and we get a lot of benefit. There's a lot of cross-fertilization, these conferences and so forth. And one of the sad things, sad for Russia, is that they have isolated themselves. And China has not completely isolated itself, but its behavior is sort of walling itself off a little bit, and that can't be to their advantage. I mean, the Chinese like to speak about win-win situations. We don't have to agree on everything, but there are areas in space, common interests that we have where we can make progress, it seems to me, and that maybe that can form a basis to try to reach out a little bit more. But it's not easy given current Chinese attitudes.
I would build on what Bruce said and say, we as a country should be wanting to partner and having as allies countries that share our same values of transparency and peaceful exploration, timely release of scientific data, and get in the context of debris, planning for safe disposal of debris. So we shouldn't be picking and choosing, but going forward with countries that share our values.
Thoughts?
I was just going to say, I think Japan has been an important partner in space for the United States, and values very much align with, to my little limited understanding, but I think even in Asia, Japan's role in space cooperation has been very important, and I think the U.S. has benefited from that.
I guess it depends on what your allies are for. Are you talking for civil space? I mean, I would say obviously it's the International Space Station, which is two sides, the Russian side and then the U.S. side, as the U.S., Japan, European Union, and Canada, let's not forget them. They built the arm, they're very proud of it. So I mean, I think those are definitely allies for future space cooperation, but then there's also, okay, what are you looking at for security issues? Are you looking, maybe the Five Eyes are gonna be important in that sort of thing. Are you gonna be looking at, the Quad in order to counter China? I think it really depends on what your priorities are and where you wanna go, and I think they do not necessarily preclude each other.
So if we look at the competition, with emerging, mega constellations and launch and so forth, not only is there maybe some resiliency benefits, there's certainly some commercial benefits. We're seeing things play out, of course, in Ukraine with sort of Starlink. Can there be, or what conditions might be imposed on cooperation between the United States and China on the regulation of these things? Would we imagine regulator-to-regulator dialogues between the FCC and China? That must terrify some people. What role should the ITU play, in this situation? I mean, when you list the other many potential candidate constellations, many of them will probably not be built. But the ones that probably will be built will be sort of probably the US or Chinese ones. So if you're looking at who's going to be doing that, is that something that only can occur within a multilateral dialogue, or can it occur in a bilateral structure? What might be the basis for discussion?
So here's where I think systems can come into play and architecture can come into play in existing. Regulating without regulating. Okay, so the creation of a space information sharing ecosystem, for example, provides an opportunity to automatically detect anomalous behavior. Right, so that level of transparency contributes to the opportunity to self-regulate based on aspirational politics and legitimacy, like we saw last year with the propositional/declarative norms of anti-satellite testing. That was a phenomenal success. The cascade happened within months, and then 155 nations voted. That is a bona fide norm, and anything other than that at this point is considered deviant behavior if you look at the definition of that particular norm. So I think that the contribution from the disciplines of systems engineering can contribute to providing information that connects treaties and policies to observed behavior in transparent ways that can be almost as beneficial as regulations themselves.
But we do need to go beyond technology. So for example, I started in my remarks, I talked about Chinese complaining to the ITU about a U.S. commercial satellite coming too close, and the U.S. government and the private company not thinking that. So clearly we have different protocols on what we judge as safe distance. So we do need to have discussions on how we think about that. We have no idea of what Chinese, for their constellations, what their post-mission disposal plans are. Obviously, as a space situation awareness, we do need better data sharing. So we do, I think we can get a lot done with technology, but we need to go beyond that.
and I think we also need to look at, okay, what are we trying to regulate? One of the things that comes up a lot when we talk about these very large constellations is there a certain point where you reach carrying capacity in these orbits? You know, if you have tens of thousands of satellites in a single orbital shell, maybe? Yeah, but no one really knows. And so there's investigation and research going into that, but it's really hard to say, well, we're going to do some sort of legislation or do some regulation. We don't even know what is our end goal. One thing that I think probably is changing pretty quickly is the idea of, the end of life, 25 years after end of life, you dispose of your satellite. Within the United States, there's discussion of making it a lot shorter. I honestly don't know, actually. I know the Chinese follow the IADC debris mitigation guidelines in terms of that, but I don't know if they've made any statements about, well, we need to shorten the end of life so we don't just have satellites floating around up there for decades after they're over. And that would be helpful to have those kind of conversations.
Quick comment.
Please.
One thing I want to emphasize here is that we don't have a whole lot of time. The march of technology in space is exploding for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is suddenly it's a whole lot cheaper to do all kinds of things that used to be not considered possible. And we only have so much time left. So as serious as the problems are now, they're probably going to be a lot more intense and potentially a lot more dangerous if we don't start cooperating in this, or at least engaging, to use the word of choice, with China and other nations as well pretty soon, that time is not on our side. We may be overtaken by events.
So when people talk about conflict, in space, sometimes there's a tendency, particularly among space people, to look at it in isolation, satellite to satellite, ASAT and whatever. But the reality is these things are all in some larger political context. Somebody is shooting at a satellite not because they don't like a satellite, but because it's doing something they don't like or they feel threatening. There's some other political or military context for it. And of course, the one that's most here is the issue of Taiwan and what might go on and what role space might play. And people are looking at lessons learned from the Ukraine situation and other lessons learned for Taiwan. How important is sort of space security relative to sort of the Taiwan scenario? Is it a sideshow? Is it a nice to have? And really the real action is in landing craft and submarines and air power projection and space is, kind of, it's cute, it's there, but it's not sort of central. The issue of the centrality of space to stability in the Western Pacific and the Indo-Pacific, generally. How would you characterize that?
Let me share this a little bit about what I know about this. Is of course the Taiwan issue is the core issue for China, and having watched the U.S. use its space-based assets to fight effectively in the Gulf War, that really shifted China's military approach to focus on winning now in informatized, local wars under informatized conditions. And that local wars, I presume, really refers principally to Taiwan. So the development of the capabilities to use space assets to fight and win a war in Taiwan has been a key focus of the Chinese PLA for decades now. So that's where it will have the most advanced capabilities. Of course, we've read now in the paper today about balloons being floated toward Taiwan, but I assume that's partly to create additional resiliency in these information gathering, intelligence gathering systems. So developing the capacity to use space assets has been a major focus of the Chinese PLA and continues to be.
Absolutely. So shifting from the security side to the then sort of the commercial side, we've been mentioning the growing importance of private companies in space, and we certainly see private, semi-private, both state-owned enterprises as well as things that we might recognize as private companies, in China and so forth. So how should the U.S. think about cooperation and competition commercially with China in these areas? Do we treat China like we would any other foreign country, France and Japan and Canada, or India even? Or do we put it in a special category? If so, why and for what purposes? So as China itself develops its own non-state enterprise, sort of entities, what should the State Department or Commerce or U.S. Trade Representative, what should we be thinking about here? Something to sort of encourage, because it gives them maybe a stake in a wealthier and stable environment, or something to discourage because it simply builds dual use capability that under civil military fusion they'll exploit for nefarious purposes? How do we balance that? Some questions are secret, some questions are mysteries,
I mean, this is a really thorny issue. This is the challenge, especially given China's military-civil fusion policy. And in any case, a lot of the technologies in space are dual use, or maybe more than dual use in any case. So here, finding a path through all of that is difficult. But I think a number of you mentioned that, that it's not impossible. So how do we sort that out? As far as whether companies are private or state-owned, that is a matter of degree, and I think that governments play an important role in promoting innovation in the space arena all around the world. So, I mean, there are certainly Chinese companies that have much closer ties to the Chinese military, and we'd want to understand that very carefully and well. There are also, as you mentioned, others that are really quite private. A lot of the new space launch companies, for example, some of the satellite companies. But as we learned in the balloon case, again, many of them may work closely with China's PLA. I mean, it's a very complicated ecosystem, and this is one of the challenges in dealing with China, is that there's no clear separation.
Yeah, I mean, I think in times past, both in Xi Jinping's early days and before that, I think the idea of there being a distinct sector was more plausible. But since what's happened with Jack Ma and other people, what's happened with Hong Kong, the idea of a private sector, while possible, is not plausible, I guess is what I was trying to say. Because so we're keying off of what do we see as what the PLA leadership has done in terms of even allowing entities, sort of to exist. And maybe that's self-defeating, that they will simply limit their competitiveness, by that heavy-handedness. They might be doing more economic damage as a result of that political requirement.
Well, there's a lot of speculation about the pattern of the Chinese state absorbing some of China's most innovative companies and what that will do for Chinese innovation long-term. Something to watch closely. And space is Xi Jinping has singled it out as a key arena for Chinese innovation, pouring a lot of resources into promoting space, including military-civil cooperation.
So we've been making progress, as Bruce mentioned, in soft power with diplomatic initiatives and the direct-ascent ASAT ban and so forth, gaining support, norms of behavior, I think gaining support. Do we risk undercutting that, or does China risk undercutting that, and both of us being condemned by developing countries in the mega constellation world? It's certainly a hot topic if you're inside of UN and co-pushing. You hear a lot of countries doing that. So is mega constellation something that, since both China and the US are doing it, there's no comparative advantage between the two? Or are there ways that we can handle mega constellations in a way that either supports or doesn't undercut our soft power and advances in other areas, convincing people that we're the wonderful people to hang out with?
This is where you have a situation, I think, where, and hopefully the United States continues to pursue it, where if you have technologists and diplomats working together to craft a coherent policy, it doesn't have to be somebody wins and somebody loses. There are gains out there for China as well as for the United States and our allies if we can work together. When you say how do we handle that kind of a situation about interaction with private Chinese companies, the first thought that came to my mind was very carefully, very carefully.
Avia?
Yeah, I would take I'll object to the premise that there's something inherently wrong with mega constellations. I mean, they are providing space-based internet to indigenous communities, to remote areas, to countries which otherwise wouldn't have internet. So they are serving a global good. Obviously, they are, they're expanding our economy, right? We have now a new sector where we can get high-paying jobs. So that's really important. And so far, I mentioned sort of two major companies that have constellations. They are being very responsible, right? So one of the companies is working closely with the ground-based astronomy community to make sure that they don't, interfere with astronomical observations. The other one is being very careful about, removing their satellites from orbit in a safe way. So so far, I do not see any indication that, we obviously have to talk. We have to have good SSA. All of that, but I don't think that has mega constellations are an inherently bad idea.
Oh, I would agree with you about that. It's sort of, but you can go too far as long as companies and entities behave responsibly with the recognition of what their larger responsibilities are. It's certainly in the national security field. Constellations are a great way to deal with security threats. My only concern on it, the reason why we raised it here, is the potential that where unchecked, completely unregulated behavior could lead to bad outcomes. 25,000 close warnings per day. That makes me feel uneasy. That's been projected where you might have satellites coming to close enough that there's a possibility of a collision. So I'm on your side on mega constellations. We need to be careful.
I would say that there's a linkage here in that one analogy that has been proffered to me is that yes, there's lots of these things up there, but if they're under control, big if, under control and managed, it's like having the USC marching band. It does all kinds of complicated things, but perfectly safe. And the link in that analogy is information. That is, if we don't really know what's up there, or if the error bubbles around our satellites are really large, and we have to be really conservative, and we don't know where these things are. So the issue of carrying capacity is in turn linked to the issue of, well, how much information do you have? If you have very little information about the space environment, if your SSA is really bad, you don't have access and whatever, then your carrying capacity is probably going to be pretty low because you don't know where things are and what risks you're running. If your information is very high resolution, broadly available, trusted, things are under control, your carrying capacity may be gigantic. And so again, there's this sort of linkage. It's not merely the matter of do I have rules and somebody in charge, it's what information do those people have and what decisions can people make based upon trusting that information.
I've got to remember that analogy of mega constellations in the USC
USC marching
band.
not Stanford.
That's
USC.
wonderful. That's wonderful.
That again underlines the importance of engaging between the U.S. and China to be able to get that information, so you can have that ability to make informed decisions and try and make good policies. Again, whether or not you like China, they are there, and the U.S. has got to figure out a way in which to engage with them in order to ensure sustainable use of outer space.
Very good. And I think with that, we're a little over past the hour. I need to conclude the session, but I'm here to remind the audience, you're welcome to join us for coffee and further conversation. And I thank you for all being here today and taking part in this discussion, and thanks for some of the really great questions. Thank you.